In a small, quiet town in Texas, life moved at its own unhurried pace. The sun would rise over the rolling hills, casting golden light on the streets and parks where people went about their daily routines. Among these residents was Chuck Norris, a man whose name carried weight far beyond this sleepy little community. Known worldwide for his martial arts skills, action-packed movies, and larger-than-life persona, Chuck preferred to live simply. Fame had never changed him. Instead, he cherished moments of peace away from the spotlight. Every afternoon, Chuck liked to take long walks through the local park. It wasn't just exercise. It was his way of connecting with nature and observing the world around him. He often stopped by a small bench near a fountain, where he'd sit and enjoy a sandwich or burger while watching families play. Dogs chase each other, and leaves rustle in the breeze. For Chuck, these moments were precious. They reminded him what truly mattered: kindness, humility, and human connection. One day, as Chuck settled onto his favorite bench with a warm meal, something caught his eye. A man stood nearby, rummaging through a trash can. His clothes were worn and patched, his face weathered by years of hardship. The man looked desperate, searching for scraps of food amidst the discarded wrappers and bottles. Chuck felt a pang of sadness. No one deserved to live like that, not when there was so much abundance in the world. Without hesitation, Chuck grabbed half of his sandwich and walked over to the man. "Hey there," he said warmly, holding out the food. "I thought you might be hungry." The man froze, surprised by the unexpected gesture. Slowly, he turned to face Chuck, his eyes wary but curious. After a moment's pause, he accepted the sandwich with a muttered, "Thank you." His voice was rough, almost unused, as though he hadn't spoken in days or maybe longer. "No problem," Chuck replied with a smile. "My name's Chuck. What's yours?" "Joe," the man mumbled between bites. He seemed hesitant to share more, but Chuck didn't push. Instead, he sat down beside Joe on the grass and began chatting casually. At first, Joe was guarded, answering questions with short, clipped responses. But as they talked, he started opening up. By the end of their conversation, Joe admitted he hadn't had a proper meal in days. Chuck promised himself he wouldn't let that happen again. From that day forward, buying Joe lunch became a daily ritual. Every afternoon, Chuck would meet him at the same bench, bringing along enough food for both of them. Sometimes it was burgers and fries from the diner down the street. Other times it was sandwiches or slices of pizza. Whatever it was, they shared it together, laughing and talking like old friends. As the weeks went by, Chuck learned more about Joe's story. Once upon a time, Joe had been a proud Marine, serving multiple tours overseas. He spoke fondly of his days in the military, recalling stories of camaraderie and bravery. But things had taken a dark turn after an injury forced him out of service. Unable to find steady work, Joe had struggled to make ends meet. Over time, his relationships with family and friends had faded, leaving him isolated and alone. Eventually, he ended up on the streets, living hand-to-mouth and trying to survive. Chuck listened intently, his respect for Joe growing with every word. Despite everything he'd been through, Joe still carried himself with dignity. He refused to ask for pity or charity, even though his situation was dire. To Chuck, this resilience made Joe all the more admirable. Though their lunches were meant to be private moments of connection, they didn't go unnoticed. Occasionally, passers-by recognized Chuck and stopped to say hello or snap a quick photo. Some even offered to help Joe, giving him spare change or offering advice. But Chuck always encouraged Joe to focus on rebuilding his confidence rather than relying on others' generosity. Despite the occasional attention, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, until one day when something strange began happening. 4 black SUVs started appearing in the area, always parked at a distance but close enough to keep an eye on Chuck and Joe. Men in suits could be seen sitting inside, occasionally stepping out to glance at the pair or jot down notes. At first, Chuck dismissed it as coincidence. Maybe they were fans hoping for an autograph, or perhaps security personnel keeping tabs on him for safety reasons. But as the days passed, the vehicles became a constant presence, lingering longer and drawing closer. Chuck couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Who were these men, and why were they so interested in 2 guys sharing lunch? More importantly, did their presence have anything to do with Joe? These questions lingered in Chuck's mind, gnawing at his curiosity. Yet, despite the mounting tension, he continued meeting Joe every day, determined not to let fear disrupt their newfound friendship. Little did Chuck know, his simple act of kindness was about to set off a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. As the days turned into weeks, Chuck and Joe's lunches became a cornerstone of their lives. For Chuck, it wasn't just about feeding Joe, it was about offering companionship, dignity, and hope. Joe, who had spent years feeling invisible, began to open up more during their conversations. He shared stories from his time in the Marines, tales of brotherhood and sacrifice that painted a picture of a man who had once been full of purpose and pride. Chuck listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and encouraging Joe to reflect on his strengths. Despite Joe's hardships, there was still a spark of resilience in him, a quiet determination that reminded Chuck of himself. Chuck admired how Joe carried himself, even in the face of adversity. While many might have given up, Joe kept moving forward, surviving one day at a time. This mutual respect deepened their bond, turning what started as a random act of kindness into something much more meaningful. However, not everything was as peaceful as it seemed. The presence of the 4 black SUVs continued to loom over their afternoons. At first, they were distant, almost blending into the background like shadows. But as time went on, they grew bolder. The vehicles would park closer to the park, sometimes idling for hours while men in suits watched silently from behind tinted windows. Occasionally, 1 or 2 of them would step out, pretending to check their phones or adjust their jackets, but their eyes always drifted toward Chuck and Joe. Chuck tried to ignore them, telling himself it was probably nothing. Maybe they were fans trying to get a glimpse of him without being too obvious. After all, Chuck Norris wasn't just any celebrity. He was a living legend. People often recognized him wherever he went, and some even treated him like a mythical figure. Perhaps these men were simply starstruck and didn't know how to approach him, or maybe they worked for some kind of security detail keeping an eye on public figures. Whatever the reason, Chuck didn't want to let it ruin the peaceful rhythm of his afternoons with Joe. But Joe noticed them too. One day, as they sat together on the bench eating burgers, Joe leaned closer and whispered, "You see those guys? Over there? They've been here every day this week." His voice was low, tinged with unease. "I don't think they're here for you." Chuck frowned, glancing briefly at the SUVs parked a short distance away. "What do you mean?" Joe hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. "Look, I don't know why they're watching us, but I've seen stuff like this before. Back when I was in the service, we used to tail people like that. Quietly, carefully. If someone thinks you're important enough to watch, it's usually because they want something." Chuck nodded slowly, considering Joe's words. He trusted Joe's instincts. After all, the man had been trained to notice details most people overlooked. Still, Chuck couldn't imagine why anyone would bother following 2 guys having lunch in a park. It didn't make sense. Was it possible they were mistaken about the SUVs? Could it really be nothing more than coincidence? The mystery only deepened as the days passed. The men in suits began taking photos, not discreetly but openly, using cameras with long lenses. Sometimes they snapped pictures of Chuck and Joe sitting together, other times focusing solely on Joe. Once, Chuck caught sight of one of them, jotting notes in a small notebook before slipping it back into his jacket pocket. Each new observation added another layer of suspicion, making it harder for Chuck to brush off their behavior as harmless curiosity. One afternoon, as they finished their meal, Joe spoke up again. "You ever wonder if helping me is putting you in danger?" he asked quietly, his tone heavy with concern. "I mean, look at them. They're not here for autographs, Chuck. Something's going on, and I don't want you getting dragged into whatever mess I'm part of." Chuck shook his head firmly. "Listen, Joe," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "I didn't start doing this because it was easy or safe. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and I'm not about to stop now. Besides, if there's trouble coming our way, we'll face it together. You're not alone in this." Joe looked at Chuck, gratitude shining in his eyes. Though he didn't say anything, The weight of Chuck's words seemed to lift some of the tension from his shoulders. For the first time in years, Joe felt like someone truly had his back. Despite Chuck's reassurance, the situation remained unsettling. The SUVs continued to appear daily, their occupants growing increasingly bold. One afternoon, as Chuck and Joe walked back to the bench after grabbing food from the diner, one of the men stepped out of his vehicle and approached them. He was tall, with sharp features and an air of authority. His suit was immaculate, and his posture suggested he was used to commanding attention. "Mr. Norris," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "A moment of your time, please." Chuck stopped, his instincts kicking in. He glanced at Joe, who looked uneasy, then turned back to the stranger. "Can I help you?" Chuck asked politely, though his tone carried an edge of caution. The man hesitated, glancing around as if ensuring no one else could overhear. "It's about your friend," he said finally, nodding toward Joe. "We've been monitoring him for some time now. There are complications we need to discuss." Chuck crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "Complications? Care to explain?" The man sighed, clearly uncomfortable. "Not here. It's sensitive information and we need to handle it discreetly. Can we arrange a meeting somewhere private?" Chuck exchanged a glance with Joe, who looked pale and anxious. Whatever this was, it wasn't good. Chuck knew he had to tread carefully. "All right," he said finally. "But whatever it is, you can tell me right now. No secrets." The man hesitated again, then shook his head. "I'm sorry, Mr. Norris. It's not that simple. Trust me. You'll want to hear this in person." With that, he turned and walked back to his SUV, leaving Chuck and Joe standing in stunned silence. As the vehicles drove off, Chuck turned to Joe, his mind racing. "Well," he said with a wry smile, "looks like things are about to get interesting." Joe managed a weak laugh, though worry clouded his face. "Interesting isn't exactly what I was hoping for," he muttered. "But if anyone can handle it, it's you, Chuck." Little did they know their quiet afternoons in the park were about to give way to a whirlwind of danger, intrigue, and revelations that neither of them could have anticipated. The next day, Chuck and Joe returned to the park, both feeling a mix of curiosity and unease. The encounter with the man in the suit had left them unsettled, but neither wanted to let fear dictate their actions. They went about their routine, as usual, buying lunch from the diner, finding their favorite bench near the fountain, and sharing stories while they ate. Yet, the presence of the black SUVs loomed larger than ever. Instead of parking at a distance, the vehicles now lined up conspicuously along the curb, their engines idling ominously. Chuck kept glancing at them out of the corner of his eye, trying to gauge whether today would bring another confrontation. Joe, on the other hand, seemed distracted, picking at his food without much appetite. "You think they're going to try talking to us again?" he asked finally, his voice low. "I don't know," Chuck replied honestly. "But if they do, we'll deal with it. Together." His tone was steady, reassuring, but there was no mistaking the tension in the air. Both men knew something big was coming. They just didn't know what. As they were finishing their meal, the moment arrived. The doors of the 4 SUVs swung, open almost simultaneously, and men in tactical gear spilled out onto the sidewalk. Their movements were precise, practiced, as though they'd rehearsed this exact scenario countless times. Passers-by stopped in their tracks, staring in confusion and alarm. Some pulled out their phones to record the scene, whispering among themselves. Was this some kind of publicity stunt involving Chuck Norris? Or was it something far more serious? The men surrounded Chuck and Joe, forming a tight circle that left no room for escape. Not that either of them tried to run. Chuck stood up slowly, his posture calm but alert. Years of martial arts training had taught him how to assess threats quickly, and while these men looked intimidating, they didn't appear hostile. Yet. Still, he placed himself slightly in front of Joe, instinctively shielding his friend. One of the men stepped forward, holding up a badge. "Mr. Norris," he said firmly, his voice carrying authority. "We need you and your friend to come with us immediately. It's a matter of national security." Joe froze, his eyes wide with panic. He gripped the edge of the bench like it might anchor him to reality. What are you talking about? He stammered, looking between Chuck and the agent. I haven't done anything wrong. Chuck raised a hand, signaling for Joe to stay calm. Then he turned to the man with the badge. National Security? He repeated, his tone measured. That's a pretty broad term. Care to elaborate? The agent hesitated, glancing around at the growing crowd of onlookers. Not here, he said tersely. This isn't the place for explanations. You'll understand once we get to our location. Chuck arched an eyebrow, unimpressed by the vague response. And if we refuse? The agent's expression hardened. Let's just say refusal isn't an option, for either of you. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Chuck weighed his options carefully. On one hand, going anywhere with these strangers felt risky, especially when they refused to explain themselves. On the other hand, resisting could escalate the situation dangerously, potentially putting innocent bystanders in harm's way. Whatever these men wanted, they weren't leaving without answers, and Chuck wasn't about to abandon Joe. All right, Chuck said finally, his voice firm but calm. We'll go, but I want your word that Joe won't be harmed. The agent nodded curtly. You have my assurance. Now, please cooperate. With that, the group moved swiftly, ushering Chuck and Joe toward separate vehicles. Joe hesitated, clearly terrified, but Chuck gave him a reassuring nod. It's going to be okay, he said quietly. Stick close, and trust me. Reluctantly, Joe climbed into the back seat of one SUV, while Chuck got into another. As the door slammed shut and the convoy sped away, the park fell eerily silent save for the murmurs of bewildered spectators wondering what they'd just witnessed. Inside the SUVs, the atmosphere was tense. Chuck sat stiffly, his mind racing, as he tried to piece together what was happening. Who were these men, and why had they singled out Joe? More importantly, how deep did this rabbit hole go? The agents offered no answers, their faces stoic as they focused on the road ahead. Chuck decided not to press them. Not yet. He needed to wait for the right moment to gather information. Meanwhile, in the other vehicle, Joe clutched the seatbelt tightly, his heart pounding. Memories of his time in the military flooded back, reminding him of situations where orders came first and questions came later, if at all. He felt trapped, powerless. But the thought of Chuck being nearby gave him a sliver of comfort. If anyone could handle this, it was Chuck Norris. After a long drive through winding roads and desolate countryside, the convoy arrived at a secluded compound surrounded by high fences and surveillance cameras. The gates opened automatically, allowing the SUVs to pass through before closing securely behind them. Chuck and Joe were led inside, where they were taken to a sterile conference room filled with monitors, maps, and documents spread across a large table. High-ranking officials waited for them, their expressions grim. One of them, a woman with sharp features and an authoritative demeanor, stepped forward. "Thank you for coming," she said, though her tone suggested they hadn't really had a choice. "We owe you an explanation." Chuck crossed his arms, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. "Start talking." The woman took a deep breath, then launched into an explanation that left both Chuck and Joe reeling. She revealed that Joe wasn't just any homeless veteran. He was once part of a top-secret military operation decades ago. The mission had gone disastrously wrong, resulting in classified information being leaked. Recently, fragments of those documents had resurfaced online, threatening national security. Someone had traced Joe's identity to the leak, believing he might still possess critical intel, or worse, that he was being targeted by those seeking to exploit the information. Joe listened in stunned silence, his mind struggling to process the revelation. "That's impossible," he protested weakly. "I didn't take anything from that mission. I barely even remember most of it. It was so long ago." "We believe you," the woman replied, surprising both men, "but others don't. And until we can prove your innocence and secure the remaining classified materials, you're in grave danger." Chuck frowned, piecing everything together. So you've been watching us because you thought Joe might lead you to whoever's behind this? She nodded. Exactly. We needed to monitor his movements without alarming him, or drawing attention to ourselves. Your involvement, well, that was unexpected. Chuck sighed, shaking his head. You realize your secrecy has only made things worse, right? If you'd approached us sooner, maybe we could have avoided all this drama. The woman looked apologetic but resolute. Perhaps. But hindsight is 20/20. What matters now is fixing the problem before it escalates further. As the gravity of the situation sank in, Chuck realized they were in deeper than he'd imagined. This wasn't just about helping a friend anymore. It was about unraveling a conspiracy that spanned decades. And as daunting as it seemed, Chuck knew one thing for certain. He wasn't backing down. Not when Joe's life and possibly the safety of countless others was on the line. The sterile conference room buzzed with tension as the high-ranking officials laid out the details of the situation. Maps, classified documents, and surveillance photos covered the table, creating a chaotic collage of information that painted a grim picture. Chuck stood at the center of it all, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Joe, on the other hand, sat slumped in his chair, looking like a man who had just been told his worst nightmare was real. The woman leading the briefing, Agent Reynolds, as she introduced herself, continued explaining the stakes. The mission you were part of, Joe, she said, her tone clinical but not unkind, involved retrieving sensitive intelligence from an enemy compound. While the operation initially succeeded, internal sabotage led to critical failures. Some of the recovered data disappeared shortly after, and fingers pointed in every direction, including yours. Joe shook his head, his voice trembling. I swear I didn't take anything. I followed orders, did my job, and came home broken. That's all I know. His hands clenched into fists, knuckles white against the dull gray of the table. Why are you dragging me into this now? It's been years. Reynolds sighed, leaning forward slightly. Because someone is using fragments of that old intel to destabilize current operations. Whoever it is knows enough to cause chaos, but not enough to fully understand what they're dealing with. And based on recent activity, we believe they've connected your name to the original leak. Chuck stepped in, his voice calm but firm. So let me get this straight. You think Joe might still have access to the missing pieces, or worse, that whoever's behind this believes he does. And instead of addressing the root problem, you've been tailing him for weeks, hoping to catch the bad guys without tipping them off. Reynolds hesitated, then nodded. Essentially, yes. We couldn't risk approaching either of you directly until we had more clarity. Unfortunately, time ran out. Chuck's jaw tightened. He understood the logic, but it didn't sit well with him. All those days of shared lunches, of rebuilding trust with Joe, had been shadowed by these people watching silently from afar. It felt manipulative, even if their intentions weren't malicious. Still, there was no point dwelling on the past. What mattered now was figuring out how to move forward. All right, Chuck said, turning to Joe. What do you remember about the mission? Anything that could help us piece this together? Joe frowned, rubbing his temples as though trying to coax memories buried deep within his mind. It was messy, he admitted finally. We were sent to extract encrypted files from a secure facility. Most of the team didn't make it back. When we returned, there were investigations, accusations. I thought I was cleared, but apparently not. He paused, his gaze distant. There was one guy, a handler named Graves. He was in charge of securing the files once we brought them back. If anyone knew where things went wrong, it was him. Reynolds exchanged a glance with another official before nodding. Graves disappeared shortly after the fallout. Last known whereabouts placed him overseas, but nothing concrete since. Chuck leaned against the table, his mind working quickly. If Graves is involved, then finding him should be our priority. But first, we need to protect Joe. If whoever's behind this thinks he has valuable information, they won't stop coming after him. Reynolds agreed. That's why we brought you here, to keep both of you safe while we investigate further. However, She hesitated, glancing at Joe. "We also need your cooperation. Any detail you can provide, no matter how small, could make a difference." Joe looked conflicted, torn between fear and determination. After a long moment, he nodded, slowly. "Fine. I'll do whatever it takes to clear my name, and to stop whoever's using that old mess to hurt people." With that decision made, the group shifted gears. Over the next several hours, Chuck and Joe worked closely with the officials, reviewing documents, analyzing timelines, and piecing together clues. Chuck's sharp instincts and strategic thinking proved invaluable, helping connect dots others might have missed. Meanwhile, Joe's insider knowledge of the military operation shed light on key moments that had previously baffled investigators. As they dug deeper, a pattern began to emerge. The rogue faction exploiting the leaked intel wasn't just some random group. They were remnants of the same organization responsible for sabotaging the original mission. Their goal? To discredit governments and sow discord by releasing fragments of outdated but still damaging information. Worse, they seemed to believe Joe held the final piece of the puzzle, a master key, so to speak, that could unlock the full potential of the stolen data. "This isn't just about framing Joe," Chuck said grimly during a break in the investigation. "They're using him as bait. If we don't act fast, they'll come for him, and they won't care who gets caught in the crossfire." Joe swallowed hard, visibly shaken but resolute. "Then we beat them to it. Let's find that key before they do." Chuck smiled faintly, impressed by Joe's newfound resolve. "That's the spirit." Over the next few days, Chuck and Joe trained rigorously alongside the agents, preparing for whatever lay ahead. For Joe, it was a chance to rediscover skills he hadn't used in years: combat techniques, survival strategies, and tactical planning. Under Chuck's guidance, he began to regain confidence, transforming from a weary, defeated man into someone ready to fight for justice. For Chuck, it was an opportunity to channel his legendary toughness into something meaningful. His martial arts expertise, combined with his natural leadership, inspired everyone around him. Together, he and Joe formed an unlikely but formidable team, united by a shared purpose. Meanwhile, the officials traced leads across multiple countries, narrowing down locations where Graves might be hiding. Every new discovery brought them closer to uncovering the truth, but also closer to danger. The rogue faction grew bolder, launching cyber attacks and issuing veiled threats aimed at silencing anyone investigating the case. Despite the mounting pressure, Chuck remained unfazed. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew they had momentum on their side. With each passing day, the bond between him and Joe grew stronger, forged in the fires of adversity and mutual respect. By the end of the week, they had pinpointed a remote warehouse on the outskirts of a major city as the likely location where the rogue operatives were storing the stolen documents. It was heavily guarded, rigged with traps and crawling with enemies, but it was also their best shot at stopping the conspiracy once and for all. As they prepared for the final confrontation, Chuck turned to Joe, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Ready to finish this?" Joe nodded, his eyes blazing with determination. "Let's do it." Little did they know, the battle awaiting them would test every ounce of courage, skill, and teamwork they possessed. But one thing was certain. When Chuck Norris and Joe stood side by side, there was no challenge they couldn't overcome. The night was cold and moonless, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow everything whole. Chuck and Joe stood outside the remote warehouse, their breaths visible in the frosty air as they prepared for what lay ahead. The building loomed. Before them, its silhouette jagged and ominous against the faint glow of distant city lights. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, their flashlights cutting through the shadows like predatory eyes scanning for prey. Behind them, a small team of agents waited silently, ready to provide backup if needed. But this wasn't their fight, not really. It belonged to Chuck and Joe. They had come too far, risked too much to let anyone else step in now. Both men knew the stakes. Failure meant not only exposing sensitive information, but also putting countless lives at risk. Success, on the other hand, meant justice. For Joe, for the fallen soldiers of his old unit, and for everyone affected by the rogue faction's schemes. Chuck glanced at Joe, his expression calm yet intense. "You good?" he asked quietly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Joe nodded, gripping the flashlight tightly in one hand. "As good as I'll ever be," he replied, his tone resolute. For the first time in years, he felt purposeful, like he was finally reclaiming a piece of himself he'd thought lost forever. With a final nod, Chuck signaled the team to move into position. The plan was simple: infiltrate the warehouse, locate the stolen documents, and neutralize any threats along the way. Simple in theory, perhaps, but executing it would require precision, teamwork, and nerves of steel. The two men slipped through the shadows, using crates and debris as cover to avoid detection. Chuck led the way, his movements fluid and deliberate. Years of martial arts training had honed his instincts to near perfection, allowing him to anticipate danger before it even materialized. Joe followed closely behind, his Marine training kicking in as he scanned their surroundings with sharp, practiced eyes. They reached the first guard post without incident. A lone operative stood near the entrance, engrossed in his phone. Chuck signaled for Joe to stay back while he handled the situation. Moving with silent efficiency, Chuck approached the man from behind, delivering a swift strike to the base of his skull that rendered him unconscious instantly. He caught the man before he could hit the ground, lowering him gently to avoid making noise. "Nice work," Joe whispered, impressed despite himself. Chuck simply shrugged, motioning for them to keep moving. Inside the warehouse, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Rows of shelves stretched endlessly in every direction, stacked high with crates and equipment. The air smelled of oil and rust, heavy with the weight of secrets hidden within these walls. Faint voices echoed in the distance, accompanied by the hum of machinery. Somewhere in this labyrinth lay the classified documents, and possibly Graves, the handler who had vanished after the original mission. As they navigated deeper into the facility, they encountered more guards. This time, Joe took the lead, disarming one opponent with a textbook takedown while Chuck subdued another with minimal effort. Their coordination was seamless, each man complementing the other's strengths. Where Chuck relied on speed and precision, Joe brought raw power and tactical awareness. Together, they were unstoppable. After clearing several rooms, they stumbled upon a locked door guarded by two operatives engaged in heated conversation. Pressing themselves flat against the wall, Chuck and Joe listened intently. "It's not here," one of the men growled, frustration evident in his voice. "We've searched everywhere. If Norris and that vet find it first—" "They won't," the second man snapped. "But if they do, we'll make sure they regret it." Chuck exchanged a glance with Joe, both men realizing the gravity of the situation. The rogue faction didn't just suspect Joe held the key. They were desperate enough to kill for it. Time was running out. Using a combination of stealth and strategy, Chuck and Joe managed to incapacitate the guards and unlock the door. Inside, they found a makeshift office cluttered with papers, laptops, and surveillance monitors. One screen displayed a live feed of the warehouse, revealing the positions of additional operatives scattered throughout the building. Another showed encrypted files labeled with codes matching those from Joe's old mission. "This is it," Joe murmured, his voice tinged with awe. "This is where they've been piecing it all together." Chuck nodded, already formulating their next steps. "Grab whatever you can carry. We need proof of their operation and anything that might help us track down Graves." While Joe gathered documents and devices, Chuck kept watch, his senses on high alert. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the far end of the warehouse, followed by shouting. Reinforcements had arrived. "We need to move. Now," Chuck barked, grabbing a duffel bag filled with evidence. The two men sprinted toward the exit, weaving through narrow aisles and dodging gunfire as alarms blared overhead. The once quiet warehouse erupted into chaos, with operatives converging on their location from all sides. Cornered in a dead-end corridor, Chuck and Joe prepared to make their stand. "You ready for this?" Chuck asked, cracking his knuckles with a wry grin. Joe smirked, despite the odds. Born ready. What followed was a flurry of action straight out of an action movie. Chuck unleashed a whirlwind of punches, kicks, and throws, taking down opponents with effortless efficiency. Joe fought with equal ferocity, channeling years of military training into every blow. Together, they carved a path through the chaos, leaving a trail of incapacitated foes in their wake. Just as they reached the final stretch, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows. It was Graves, the handler who had disappeared decades ago. His face was lined with age, but his eyes burned with malice. In his hand he held a small device glowing ominously. "You shouldn't have come here," Graves snarled, raising the device. "None of you understand what's at stake." Chuck stepped forward, his voice steady and commanding. "Put it down, Graves. It's over." Graves laughed bitterly. "Over? This is just the beginning." With that, he pressed a button, triggering a countdown timer on the device. Realizing it was a detonator, Chuck sprang into action. "Joe, get out of here. I'll handle him." "No way," Joe shot back. "We're finishing this together." Side by side, they closed in on Graves, who lashed out with surprising agility. The ensuing struggle was brutal, each punch and counterattack fueled by desperation. Finally, Chuck delivered a decisive kick that sent Graves sprawling, knocking the device from his grasp. Joe dove for it, deactivating the timer with seconds to spare. Panting heavily, the two men stared at each other, relief washing over them. They had done it. They had stopped the rogue faction and recovered the stolen intel. As agents flooded the warehouse to secure the area, Chuck placed a hand on Joe's shoulder. "You did good, Joe," he said sincerely. "Real good." Joe smiled, tears glistening in his eyes. "Couldn't have done it without you, Chuck." Their journey wasn't just about stopping a conspiracy. It was about redemption, friendship, and proving that even in the darkest moments, hope could prevail. And as they walked out of the warehouse together, battered but victorious, they knew their bond would last a lifetime. The aftermath of the warehouse raid unfolded like a storm slowly calming after its peak fury. Chuck and Joe emerged into the cool night air, their bodies weary, but their spirits unbroken. The agents who had been waiting outside rushed forward to secure the area, confiscating evidence and rounding up the remaining operatives. Sirens wailed in the distance as local authorities arrived on the scene, alerted by the chaos that had spilled out of the shadows. For Chuck and Joe, however, the adrenaline was beginning to wear off, replaced by a profound sense of relief and accomplishment. They stood side by side, watching as Graves was handcuffed and led away, his face twisted with rage and defeat. It was over. The rogue faction's plans had been thwarted, and the stolen documents were safely in the hands of those who could protect them. Agent Reynolds approached the pair, her usual stoic demeanor softened by gratitude. "You two did something extraordinary tonight," she said, her voice sincere. "Not many people would have stepped up the way you did." Chuck shrugged modestly, brushing dirt off his jacket. "We just did what needed to be done." Joe nodded in agreement, though there was a hint of pride in his eyes. For so long, he had felt like a ghost, someone forgotten by the world. But now, standing here with Chuck and the team, he realized he mattered. His actions had made a difference. That knowledge alone was worth more than anything else. Reynolds handed them each a folder containing details about the next steps. "With the evidence we've gathered, we'll be able to dismantle the entire network behind this operation. And thanks to your testimony, Joe, we can finally clear your name." Joe took the folder, his hands trembling slightly. "It's been a long time coming," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd see the day when I could hold my head high again." Chuck placed a reassuring hand on Joe's shoulder. "You earned it, buddy. Every bit of it." In the days that followed, life began to settle into a new rhythm for both men. Joe was offered housing through a veteran support program, along with access to medical care and counseling services. He accepted gratefully, knowing it was the first step toward rebuilding his life. Though the road ahead wouldn't be easy, he faced it with renewed determination. Chuck stayed in touch, visiting often and checking in to make sure Joe was adjusting well. Their lunches continued, though now they happened in cozy diners instead of park benches. As for Chuck, The events at the warehouse only added to his already legendary status. News outlets buzzed with stories of how he and Joe had taken down a dangerous conspiracy, painting them as modern-day heroes. While Chuck didn't seek the attention, he appreciated the opportunity to shine a light on issues affecting veterans like Joe. He used his platform to advocate for better resources and support systems, urging communities to look out for those who had served their country. But beyond the headlines and accolades, what truly mattered to Chuck was the bond he had formed with Joe. What started as a simple act of kindness had blossomed into an unbreakable friendship, a testament to the power of compassion and trust. Both men had changed because of their journey. Chuck had reminded himself of the importance of staying grounded and helping others, no matter how small the gesture might seem. And Joe had rediscovered his strength, proving to himself that he was capable of greatness even after years of hardship. Months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Chuck and Joe found themselves back at the park where it all began. The fountain still gurgled cheerfully and children laughed as they chased each other across the grass. Sitting on their favorite bench, they shared a meal, just like old times. But this time, everything felt different. There was no shadow of danger lurking nearby, no black SUVs idling ominously. Just peace. You know, Joe said between bites of a burger. I never got the chance to thank you properly. Chuck raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. For what? For believing in me when no one else did, Joe replied, his tone serious. You didn't have to do any of this, Chuck. You could have walked away at any point, but you didn't. And I'll never forget that. Chuck smiled, his expression warm. That's what friends are for, Joe. Besides, you saved my life back there too. We're even. Joe chuckled, shaking his head. Still feels like I owe you one. Well, if you insist, Chuck teased, leaning back against the bench. How about you promise to keep kicking butt and taking names? That's thanks enough for me. They both laughed, the sound carrying on the breeze like music. For a moment neither spoke, content to simply enjoy the quiet camaraderie they had built together. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the park. Life wasn't perfect, it rarely was. But for Chuck and Joe, it was good. Their story spread far and wide, inspiring countless others to look beyond appearances and see the potential for greatness in everyone. People began sharing tales of their own acts of kindness, sparked by Chuck's example. Strangers reached out to offer help to veterans struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. Communities rallied around causes that had once seemed hopeless, fueled by the belief that even the smallest efforts could lead to extraordinary outcomes. And so, the legend of Chuck Norris and his unlikely ally continued to grow. It wasn't just about stopping conspiracies or saving the day. It was about reminding the world that humanity thrived on connection, courage, and compassion. Through their journey, Chuck and Joe proved that true heroes weren't defined by fame or fortune, but by the choices they made and the lives they touched. As they sat together in the fading light, watching the park come alive with laughter and joy, Chuck turned to Joe with a grin. You know, I think we make a pretty good team. Joe smirked, raising his soda can in a mock toast. Yeah, well, don't let it go to your head, Chuck. You're not invincible. Chuck laughed, clinking his drink against Joe's. Close enough. And with that, the two friends settled back, ready to face whatever adventures lay ahead. Together.